Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes healing doesn't start with a dramatic moment or a painful memory. Sometimes it starts with a strange, quiet discomfort that appears when nothing is wrong. You might be sitting alone in your room. You might be scrolling through your phone. You might be washing dishes or staring out a window, and suddenly, without warning, you feel a small tightening in your body. A subtle restlessness, a sensation that something in you is pulling back, even though there's nothing on the outside to pull away from. It's an odd feeling, almost like an instinct, that activates without a clear trigger. And you can't explain it because logically everything is fine. Emotionally, though, something inside retreats, something folds inward, something disappears into the corners of your inner world, and you can sense it even if you can't articulate it. That sensation is the part of you that hides. It doesn't hide dramatically. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't draw attention. If anything, it hides in ways so subtle that you've likely confused it with personality traits. Calling it shyness, calling it introversion, calling it overthinking, calling it being low energy or not in the mood. But beneath those labels lies something deeper, a well-practiced pattern of shrinking whenever the possibility of exposure appears. Exposure, not in the sense of being watched or criticized, but exposure in the emotional sense. Being known, being felt, being understood, being seen for who you actually are instead of the version you carefully present. This hidden part of you did not form through one single event. It formed gradually through thousands of micro-experiences, subtle reactions from others, subtle disappointments, subtle moments where expressing your full self didn't feel fully welcomed. And sometimes it formed through environments that weren't unsafe, but simply unresponsive. You may have grown up around people who didn't truly listen, people who nodded but didn't understand, people who asked questions but didn't wait for the answers, people who offered protection but not attunement, and when attunement is missing, hiding becomes natural. You learn that your inner world is something that must be carried quietly. You learn to monitor yourself, to adjust yourself, to soften yourself, to make sure you never take up more emotional space than what feels allowed. Over the years, this part of you becomes so practiced at staying out of sight that it moves automatically. You don't even realize when you're suppressing a thought. You don't realize when you avoid a conversation that matters. You don't realize when you silence your needs before anyone has the chance to hear them. You don't realize how much effort it takes to act normal in situations where your inner world feels fragile. But the hidden part notices. It always notices. It lives in the corners of your emotional experiences, waiting for the slightest sign that it might be safer to step out or safer to retreat again. Healing this part of you begins with awareness. Not in the dramatic sense of sudden epiphanies, but in the quiet, slow noticing of when you vanish inside yourself. You may find that you disappear mentally during conversations, not because you don't care, but because the idea of being emotionally present feels risky. You may find that you disconnect during moments of potential closeness, even when you long for connection. Because emotional closeness requires visibility, you may find that you hold back compliments, opinions, desires, or expressions of affection. Not because you're cold, but because showing them feels like peeling back a layer of yourself you aren't used to revealing. This hidden part of you isn't wrong for behaving this way. It has reasons that may not be conscious, but are deeply embedded in your emotional blueprint. And healing doesn't begin by confronting it, forcing it, or demanding that it be brave. Healing begins by listening, by paying attention to the subtle signals it sends. Sometimes the part of you that hides communicates through hesitation, a small, almost imperceptible pause before you speak. A moment where your intuition says something, but your mouth stays shut. A flicker of emotion that you smother before it can travel up your throat. These moments are invitations, not warnings. They are opportunities to gently ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if I express myself here? What am I protecting? What part of me feels exposed? Other times the hidden part speaks through discomfort. When someone gives you genuine praise and your first instinct is to deflect it. When someone gets close to understanding, you suddenly feel the urge to pull away. When someone asks how you feel and you respond with something neutral, even though your emotions are anything but neutral. These moments are not failures. They are openings. They are signs that your inner world is trying to negotiate safety with your outer world. And then there are the moments where your hidden part speaks through silence. The silence you keep when you are upset, the silence you keep when you are overwhelmed, the silence you keep when you wish someone would notice your hurt even though you haven't said a word. Silence becomes a language when your voice has been shaped more by caution than by expression. And healing means learning how to translate that silence, not to replace it with constant talking, but to understand what it's trying to protect. As you deepen your awareness, you start discovering something crucial. The part of you that hides is not inherently afraid of people. It's afraid of exposure, because exposure once meant vulnerability. Vulnerability once meant unpredictability, and unpredictability once meant emotional instability, criticism, or emotional abandonment. The body remembers these things even when the mind forgets. So your hidden part isn't trying to ruin your life or limit your growth. It's trying to keep you safe in the only way it learned how. The next phase of healing involves differentiation. You slowly begin to separate the fears of your past from the realities of your present. This doesn't happen instantly. It happens through countless small moments where you notice that nothing bad happens when you express a small truth. Nothing collapses when you ask for reassurance. Nothing explodes when you disagree kindly. Nothing falls apart when you allow someone to see a glimpse of your real emotional landscape. These micro-confirmations begin teaching your system something it never learned before. That visibility can coexist with safety, and this is where healing starts becoming transformative, because once the hidden part learns that safety and authenticity can exist together, even in tiny doses, it begins to relax. It begins to test the waters. It begins to peek out in situations where it would normally retreat, not because it is confident, but because it is curious. Curiosity is a sign of healing. When the hidden part becomes curious, it is telling you maybe it's time. Time to gently expand, time to gently show, time to gently exist without shrinking. But its curiosity requires patience. It requires consistency. It requires an inner environment of compassion rather than criticism. And this is where we continue next. As your curiosity grows, something subtle begins shifting inside you. The hidden part, the one that used to retreat automatically, starts observing your present moments with a little more openness. It watches how people respond to your honesty. It notices how the world doesn't fall apart when you express a need or share a feeling. It sees how some people actually lean closer, not away, when you reveal something genuine. And for perhaps the first time, this hidden part begins to consider a possibility. It never allowed itself to imagine that being seen might not always lead to pain. But this shift doesn't happen smoothly. Healing rarely moves in straight lines. You may find days where you feel bold, expressive, present in your emotions, and then suddenly, without warning, you find yourself shrinking back into old habits of withdrawal. This isn't regression, it's recalibration. Your system is learning a new rhythm after years, maybe decades, of operating in a protective mode. And like any deeply ingrained pattern, it will resist change. Sometimes the hidden part doesn't trust easily. It needs proof. It needs repetition. It needs gentle, consistent reassurance that visibility is no longer a threat. One of the biggest steps in this journey is learning how to stay with yourself in moments of emotional exposure. Not abandonment, not dissociation, not shutting down, but staying present with your own feelings even when they feel bigger than your comfort zone. This might look like letting yourself experience sadness without minimizing it. It might look like acknowledging anger without forcing it into politeness. It might look like accepting joy without waiting for something to ruin it. It might look like allowing anxiety to pass through you without assuming something catastrophic is about to happen. Staying with yourself is a skill, a profound, powerful skill, and it is one of the core pillars of healing the part of you that hides, because for so many years, this hidden part has been used to being left alone with overwhelming feelings. It never learned how to move through those emotions safely because there was no one present to guide it. So now, as an adult, you become that guiding presence. You become the steady voice, the grounding energy, the calm witness that the younger version of you always needed. This is emotional repairing, not in a grand dramatic sense, but in simple everyday ways. Ways like saying it's okay to feel this instead of what's wrong with me. Ways like asking, what do I need in this moment instead of why am I like this? Ways like taking a break when overwhelmed instead of forcing yourself to push through. When you show up for yourself in this consistent way, the hidden part begins to soften. It stops bracing for impact every time you express a feeling. It stops expecting rejection when you say something honest. It stops assuming that vulnerability will be punished. Slowly, it begins to understand that your current life is not the same as your past conditions. And that realization, sometimes subtle, sometimes profound, is the beginning of inner freedom. But healing this part also requires something that many people overlook: the willingness to be misunderstood, because visibility doesn't guarantee perfect understanding from others. There will be times when someone misreads your intentions, misinterprets your feelings, or doesn't respond the way you hoped. In the past, misunderstandings may have felt dangerous, like losing love, losing safety, losing connection. So the hidden part learned to anticipate others' needs, manage their emotions, shift its identity to avoid conflict or disappointment. But now healing means learning that misunderstandings are not catastrophes. They are part of human interaction. You can clarify them, you can talk through them, you can survive them without losing yourself. This is a difficult but transformative lesson for the part of you that hides, because it teaches that you do not need perfect acceptance to exist. You don't need flawless approval to be yourself, and you don't need to mold your truth to fit others' expectations. Your worth is not dependent on the accuracy of how others perceive you. When this truth begins settling into your nervous system, something inside you expands. You breathe differently, you express yourself differently, you begin to show up with a sense of groundedness, one that doesn't crumble at the first sign of misalignment or discomfort. Another key aspect of healing is learning to recognize when you're hiding in ways that seem harmless but are emotionally costly. For example, humor can become a disguise. Being easygoing can become camouflage. Staying busy can become a form of emotional disappearance. You might be the person everyone loves because you never cause problems, but internally, you may feel invisible, not because others don't care, but because you continuously step out of sight to keep the peace. In healing, you start to notice how often you silence yourself in these seemingly harmless ways, and once you notice, you begin gently reversing them, not with force, but with intentional presence. You might start saying a small truth even when you're tempted to brush it aside. You might start asking for a tiny preference even when part of you feels guilty. You might allow people to support you even when you're used to being the strong one. Each small act of visibility rewires your emotional system. Each small act tells the hidden part, you don't have to disappear anymore. And each small act builds the foundation for deeper transformation. At this point in your journey, you may also encounter a surprising form of resistance, a quiet sadness. This sadness is not depression, it is recognition of how long you lived present, recognition of how many parts of yourself were tucked away, recognition of how much energy it took to maintain a version of yourself that kept you safe, but also kept you small. This sadness is natural. It is the mourning of years of emotional absence, and honoring this sadness is part of the healing, not to dwell in it, but to acknowledge it with compassion. The hidden part of you holds stories that were never spoken, needs that were never met, and emotions that were never validated. When you allow sadness to surface, you're not regressing, you're clearing space. Clearing space for joy that doesn't feel guilty, clearing space for presence that doesn't feel dangerous, clearing space for authenticity that doesn't feel like a performance. As you continue healing, you begin to realize that the hidden part isn't trying to stay small forever. It has simply been waiting for an environment where authenticity doesn't feel like exposure, where being known doesn't feel like a risk, where vulnerability doesn't feel like a trap. And that environment begins with you. Your voice, your boundaries, your self-trust, your internal safety, and all of this leads us toward the next phase of healing, learning what it means to step into visibility without losing your sense of safety. Stepping into visibility while maintaining a sense of safety is a delicate art. It requires a balance your nervous system may have never learned because for most of your life, visibility and danger were tightly connected. Being seen meant being judged. Being seen meant being corrected. Being seen meant being compared, criticized, or misunderstood. And so the hidden part of you associated visibility with risk and hiding with protection. Healing means slowly teaching your system a new association. That visibility can be grounding, not threatening, empowering, not overwhelming, healing, not harmful. But this shift takes time, and it begins with the smallest act of internal permission. You start by allowing yourself to exist without constantly editing your presence. This might sound simple, but it's one of the most courageous things you'll ever do. Maybe you've spent years adjusting your tone, softening your opinions, filtering your joy, shrinking your charisma, or controlling your expressions so no one sees too much of you. These habits become automatic, like second nature. You do them without thinking, and healing requires you to notice them, not to shame yourself, but to understand how deeply your need for safety shaped your identity. When you notice these patterns, you begin creating tiny openings where authenticity can enter, slowly, gently, without pressure. For example, you may allow yourself to finish a sentence that you normally would have cut short. You may speak with your natural enthusiasm instead of toning it down. You may share a memory without rehearsing it in your mind first. You may express your dislike for something without apologizing. These small acts signal something powerful to the hidden part of you. It is safe for me to take up space. You're not shouting your presence into the world. You're simply allowing your truth to exist without immediately shrinking it. This gentle expansion is how healing becomes embodied rather than conceptual. As you continue this process, a new kind of fear may surface, the fear of being too much. This fear is common among people who learn to hide. You may worry that your needs burden others, that your emotions complicate relationships, that your excitement annoys people, that your sadness inconveniences them, that your boundaries push them away. But this fear doesn't reflect reality. It reflects conditioning. When you grew up in environments where emotional expression was met with overwhelm, frustration, or indifference, you learned that minimizing yourself was a form of caretaking. Now in healing, you must learn that expanding yourself is not harm, it is honesty. You might also fear that if you allow yourself to be fully seen, people will expect more from you than you can give. This is another subtle way the hidden part protects you. It's afraid of obligation, of pressure, of becoming responsible for someone else's emotional world. So it keeps you small, not because it doubts your worth, but because it doubts your capacity. Healing means acknowledging that your capacity is not fixed. It grows when you grow. Your emotional bandwidth expands when you stop abandoning yourself and start supporting yourself. The more you show up internally, the more you can show up externally without feeling overwhelmed. Another powerful layer of healing is learning to let others meet you halfway. When you've spent most of your life hiding parts of yourself, you might assume that if you don't initiate emotional labor, relationships will fall apart. Or you may believe that connection depends entirely on your effort. These beliefs come from a place of hyperindependence, a coping mechanism that makes hiding feel easier than relying. Healing asks you to test the possibility that you don't have to carry everything. You can share parts of yourself without having to manage the other person's reaction. You can express your feelings without needing to control the outcome. You can allow others to show care without assuming it comes with conditions. Letting people meet you halfway means trusting that you are not the only one responsible for the emotional temperature of your relationships. It means giving others a chance to understand you, support you, or simply be present with you. This doesn't mean exposing yourself recklessly. It means choosing carefully who you open up to, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. Healing teaches you that your inner world is valuable, and not everyone deserves immediate access to it. The hidden part learns that discernment is not the same as hiding. Discernment is healthy. Hiding is protective. Healing involves slowly replacing protection with discernment. At this stage of the journey, your relationship with your past becomes important. The hidden part of you doesn't just hold fear. It holds timelines. It holds outdated stories that once defined how you navigated the world. Stories like, "I'm safest when I'm quiet. My feelings make things worse. My needs inconvenience people. If I show myself, I'll be judged." Or, "It's easier to disappear than to risk being seen." These stories were once true in the environments that shaped you, but they may no longer be true now. Healing means acknowledging that your past was real, but it's not your destiny. You don't have to heal by rewriting the past. You heal by updating your relationship with it. This might involve gently revisiting memories that shaped your need to hide, not to re-experience the pain, but to understand how your younger self interpreted it. You might realize that what you thought was rejection was actually emotional immaturity in the adults around you. What you thought was judgment was actually someone projecting their insecurities onto you. What you thought was abandonment was someone who lacked the capacity to show up in the way you needed. Seeing these memories through adult eyes doesn't erase the hurt, but it brings clarity, and clarity reduces fear. One of the most transformative realizations during healing is recognizing that the hidden part of you was never broken. It was intelligent. It adapted to survive situations where you lacked support or safety. It became cautious because caution was necessary. It hid because hiding reduced conflict or disappointment. It withdrew because expressing your true emotions would have caused more harm than silence. The hidden part deserves respect, not correction. It protected you until you were strong enough to protect yourself. And now, as you become more emotionally present, the hidden part begins handing its responsibilities back to you. You start making decisions based not on fear, but on self-awareness. You start speaking from a place of authenticity rather than defense. You start choosing boundaries that honor your needs instead of suppressing them. You start seeing relationships not as power balances but as collaborations. And slowly you realize that you no longer need to hide to feel safe. Safety begins coming from within, not from disappearing, but from self-connection. At this point, you may begin experiencing a feeling that is unfamiliar yet deeply comforting. Emotional spaciousness. This is the sensation of existing without constant inner tension, the sensation of breathing without bracing, the sensation of speaking without rehearsing, the sensation of being present without monitoring yourself. Emotional spaciousness feels like a return to something you didn't even know you lost. It feels like the beginning of a life lived in color, not in shadow. But there is still more to understand, more to integrate, more to reclaim. The hidden part doesn't stop speaking. It simply speaks differently, and the next phase of healing brings a deeper transformation, the reintegration of the self you abandoned in order to survive. In the end, healing the part of you that hides is not a race, not a transformation, and not a dramatic breakthrough. It is a quiet reclamation, a slow, steady awakening, a gradual return to yourself that happens in moments so small they're almost unnoticeable until one day they aren't. You begin to realize that your hidden parts were never waiting for courage, confidence, or approval. They were waiting for presence. They were waiting for you to stop rushing past your own feelings long enough to ask, "Is there something here you need me to hear?" They were waiting for you to stop calling them weak. They were waiting for you to stop apologizing for them. They were waiting for you to stop treating them like shadows you needed to outgrow instead of chapters you needed to understand. And when you finally sit with them without judgment, without urgency, without abandonment, you notice something unexpected. They soften. They loosen their grip. They breathe. Not because they're fully healed, but because they finally feel seen. Healing doesn't mean the hidden part of you suddenly becomes bold, expressive, or fearless. It simply means it no longer has to disappear every time something feels unfamiliar. It means you don't silence yourself out of habit. It means you don't shrink to make others comfortable. It means you don't disappear from your own life just because visibility feels foreign. Healing is the slow integration of what once felt unbearable into what now feels livable. It is the steady merging of who you've been and who you're becoming. It is the quiet realization that the part of you that hides was never dysfunctional. It was protective. It was loyal. It carried burdens it should never have carried for longer than it ever should have. And it survived, and now it deserves rest. It deserves compassion. It deserves a place in your present, not as a frightened version of you, but as proof of your endurance. When that part of you finally steps forward, not perfectly, not confidently, but willingly, you'll feel a shift. Not loud, not dramatic, more like a small door inside you opening for the first time in years. A door to authenticity, to gentleness, to steadiness, to a life where you no longer negotiate your worth with the world. You'll realize that you don't have to force yourself into the light. You just have to stop hiding from your own. And slowly, gradually, beautifully, you begin to inhabit your life with a little more presence, a little more truth, a little more self-respect. The part of you that hides doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes the part of you that listens deeply, the part that feels fully, the part that understands nuance, softness, and truth more than anyone else ever could. And one day you will look back and realize something profound. You didn't just heal the part of you that hides. You healed the part of you that believed hiding was the only way to survive. Now you're not just living. You're living as someone who belongs to themselves, and that gently, quietly, steadily is the beginning of everything. If you made it this far, drop 100 in the comments so I know you're part of the 1% who's serious about growth.